The Port Moresby Solomons Operation and the Allied Reaction, 27 April, 11 May 1942. The ultimately unsuccessful Japanese attempt to capture Port Moresby in May 1942 is commonly referred to as the Battle of the Coral Sea. Almost all focus is usually given to the decisive tactical engagement between carrier forces. However, the Japanese effort was officially codenamed Moresby Operation and was often called the Port Moresby Solomons Operation. In formal terms, it was, on the Japanese side, a major offensive and joint operation planned and executed to achieve an operational objective, the capture of Port Moresby on the Australian territory of New Guinea, now Papua New Guinea. For the Allies, in contrast, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a major defensive and joint operation aimed at preventing an enemy landing at Port Moresby. Both U.S. and Australian naval forces and land-based aircraft took part. The Japanese inflicted larger losses on the Allies than they suffered, and hence won a clear tactical victory. However, the Japanese failed to achieve the ultimate objective of their operation, and hence the Allies won an operational victory. The operation was the first major setback for the Japanese in their drive, which started with their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, to expand vastly their control in the Pacific. It is a powerful example of the value and importance of military strategy. Dr. Milan Vago has been a professor in the Joint Military Operations Department at the U.S. Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island, since August 1991. A native of Bosnia and Herzegovina, he obtained political asylum in the United States in 1976. Dr. Vago has been an adjunct professor at the Defense Intelligence College, 1984 to 1981, and a senior fellow at the Center for Naval Analyses in Alexandria, Virginia, 1985 to 87, and at the former Soviet Army Studies Office, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, 1987 to 89. He earned a BA in 1970 and an MA in U.S. Latin American History in 1973 at the University of Belgrade, and his PhD in European History from the George Washington University, 1981. He holds a license as a Master Mariner. Dr. Vago has published 8 books, including the textbooks Operational Warfare, 2001, and Joint Operational Warfare, Theory and Practice, 2008, reprint 2009, and The Battle for Leyte, 1944, Allied and Japanese Plans, Preparations, and Execution, plus numerous articles in professional journals. He published his most recent book, Operational Warfare at Sea, Theory and Practice, in December 2008.
Human factor in warfare. More generally, and despite the passage of time, the Port Moresby Solomons Operation provides a number of operational lessons of great importance to current and future naval leaders. The strategic setting. By the beginning of 1942, the strategic situation in the southwestern and South Pacific had become extremely serious for the Allies. The Japanese were on the verge of victory in the Philippines. They were making rapid progress in their invasion of the Netherlands East Indies, NEI, and thereby threatened northern Australia. The Japanese had included the invasion of the Bismarck Archipelago in their plan, developed in November 1941, as the first operational stage of the war in the Pacific. In their view, their major base at Truk in the Central Carolines would not be secure as long as Rabaul, New Britain, was in enemy hands. Accordingly, Japanese troops captured Rabaul on 23 January 1942. The fall of Rabaul alarmed greatly the Australian government and people. Australia's northeast area was now virtually unprotected. The Japanese next occupied the rest of New Britain, as well as the Admiralties, New Ireland, and Bougainville in the Upper Solomons. The vulnerability of Australia was shown on 19 February 1942, when 4 Japanese fleet carriers conducted a massive raid on the port of Darwin. By February 1942, the Japanese had accomplished all their initial strategic objectives, and at far less cost than expected. However, instead of consolidating gains, the Japanese leaders made the fatal mistake of deciding to expand their defense perimeter. Japanese Imperial General Headquarters, IGHQ in Tokyo, had initiated the staff studies for the second operational stage of the war in January 1942. The Plans Division of the 1st Operational Section of the Navy Section of IGHQ was a strong advocate of invading Australia. As early as December 1941, the Naval General Staff had insisted on capturing the strategically important points in northern and northeastern Australia. This could be accomplished, it believed, with very little expenditure in men and materiel. The Naval General Staff argued that Australia represented the greatest threat to Japanese control in the South Pacific, because it could serve as a base for a counteroffensive. Australia also possessed economic resources of great potential importance to Japan's war industry. General Hajime Sugiyama, chief of IGHQ's Army Section, Army General Staff, was opposed to invasion of Australia. He said, "If we take only part of Australia, it could lead to a war of attrition and escalate into total war." The Army General Staff instead intended to strengthen the defensive perimeter against the growing enemy force in Australia by capturing Port Moresby and some important positions in the South Pacific. The Japanese had not included Port Moresby as an objective in their plans.
25th Air Flotilla intensified its attacks on Port Moresby in early April from Rabaul and Lae. The Japanese raids generally used only about half of a dozen land-based attack aircraft and several fighters. For this reason, these attacks were not decisive. The 25th Air Flotilla began full-scale raids on Port Moresby on 17 April with 15 fighters and 7 attack aircraft, striking almost daily until the beginning of May. The Japanese plans for the Port Moresby Solomons operation were based on poor knowledge of the whereabouts and movements of enemy naval forces, the carriers in particular. This was a major reason for several decisions that caused major problems and setbacks for the Japanese in the course of the operation. Their main sources of information were visual observation by land-based search aircraft and submarines, interrogations of captured airmen, analysis of combat experience, and intercepts of plaintext messages. The Japanese, unable to decode the Allied radio traffic, lacked direct knowledge of enemy planned
Operations in the Indian Ocean to massive raids by the 1st Air Fleet, carrier striking force, against Ceylon and enemy shipping in the Bay of Bengal in early April. This operation would tie up 5 of the Navy's 6 large carriers until the end of April. Then at least 3 carriers, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, would have to return to the homeland for upkeep and refitting. The 1st Air Fleet would not be ready to conduct another major operation until the end of May. The differences between the Navy and the Army regarding the objectives in the second operational stage of the war were heatedly discussed during late January and February 1942. On 7 March, the services tried to resolve the dispute at the Imperial Liaison Conference in Tokyo. On 13 March, an agreement was finally reached. It was reported to the Emperor and distributed in a document entitled Fundamental Outline of Recommendations for Future War Leadership. In it, the option of invading Australia was dropped. On this basis, in mid-March, the combined fleet formulated a strategic plan for the second operational stage of the war. The plan contemplated the capture of Midway Island by using the full strength of the combined fleet with the aim of luring the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a, quote, decisive battle. From Yamamoto's perspective, a great advantage of this plan was that it would require minimal participation by the Army and so would not risk an Army veto in IGHQ. The combined fleet plan was the subject of a discussion at a conference held at IGHQ on 2 to 3 April. At the conference, the Naval General Staff insisted that the Midway operation include simultaneous capture of the western part of the Aleutian chain, and the combined fleet acquiesced. The Naval General Staff also argued that the entire operation should be delayed until late June because it was unwilling to divert forces from the operation to secure Rabaul in favor of operations in the Central and North Pacific. Yet on 5 April, the Naval General Staff, faced with a threat by Yamamoto to resign, reluctantly agreed to his timetable for a Midway Aleutians operation. In late April, IGHQ's Army and Naval General Staffs agreed to a compromise plan that envisaged the occupation of strategic points in New Caledonia, the Fiji Islands, and Samoa to be carried out sometime after the Port Moresby Solomons operation. For its part, the Combined Fleet Staff argued that any South Pacific project should be delayed until after the Midway Aleutians operation. The Naval General Staff replied that preparations for operations in the South Seas were already started. It also maintained that Midway was beyond the effective range of Japanese land-based aircraft, and that it would be very difficult to garrison and supply even if captured, while its loss would not significantly affect American morale. In the Naval General Staff's view, cutting the supply lines to Australia would greatly affect morale, and that would be more likely than a threat to Midway to draw the Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle, thereby shortening the war. The differences between the combined fleet and the Naval General Staff over the objectives and timetable of the second operational stage of war were not resolved until after the Allied carrier raid on Tokyo, the Doolittle Raid, on 18 April. This raid had, as its planners intended, a great psychological effect on the Japanese strategic leadership. Both the Navy and the Army had failed in their duty to safeguard the homeland and the emperor from attack. Yamamoto regarded it as a mortifying personal defeat. The Japanese admirals and generals, suffering great loss of face, now overreacted and made several strategic decisions that proved fatal for Japan. Specifically, they adopted Yamamoto's argument to extend the defense perimeter into the Central Pacific. A plan for the second operational stage of war was approved by IJN Directive No. 86. It set, following raids in the Indian Ocean in April, the occupation of Port Moresby for early May 1942, of Midway and the Aleutians for early June 1942, and of Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia for July. On the American side, strategy in the Pacific was largely driven by Admiral Ernest J. King, appointed as Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Navy on 20 December 1941. On 16 March, President Roosevelt relieved Admiral Harold Stark as Chief of Naval Operations, CNO, and 10 days later, King assumed the duties of CNO in addition to those of King. Stark had been very pessimistic about the Allies' ability to stem the tide of Japanese conquests. He had been willing to abandon all positions west of the international dateline, longitude 180 degrees east, including the Philippines and Australia. In contrast, King was determined to oppose any further Japanese advance in the Pacific and eventually to mount a counteroffensive. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who had replaced Admiral Husband Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet on 31 December 1941, was directed by King to halt the Japanese advance, keep the line of communications with Australia open, and mount raids with carrier forces against the enemy strongpoints in the Pacific. Because of the growing Japanese threat to Australia, the British had suggested that the U.S. Pacific Fleet assume responsibility for defending the northeastern approaches to Australia and for securing Australia's lines of communication with the United States. At first, the U.S. Navy had been reluctant to assume such responsibilities, the Pacific Fleet having been greatly weakened by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet King agreed on 1 January 1942 to study the problem. On 27 January 1942, the ANZAC area was established. It encompassed Eastern Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, New Caledonia, New Hebrides, modern Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji. Australia and New Zealand would provide forces and would be supported by the United States. The combined force would be under command of an American flag officer and directly subordinate to the Cinque of the United States Fleet, King, 23.
King appointed Vice Admiral Herbert F. Leary as the Anzac Area Commander. Leary's task was to cover the northeastern and eastern approaches to Australia and New Zealand, protect friendly shipping in the area, support the defensive island positions, and destroy enemy forces in the area. 24. At the end of February 1942, the Australian Chiefs of Staff assessed the country's defense in light of the fall of Singapore, the raid on Darwin, and the impending Allied collapse in the NEI. They believed that if the Japanese advanced into the Coral Sea to cut off Australia's communications with North America, they might attack Port Moresby and then the Australian mainland. In their view, Port Moresby was too vulnerable to be reinforced, but too important to be abandoned. Another option for the Japanese was to advance to the Solomon Islands and then capture the New Hebrides and New Caledonia. In the spring of 1942, the only troops then available for defense of Australia were about 265,000 militia, poorly trained and equipped. The best Australian troops were deployed abroad, 3 divisions in the Middle East and elements of 1 division in Singapore, Timor, Ambon, and Rabaul. By mid-April, the Australian Army at home had 2 first-line divisions, an armored division, and 8 second-line militia divisions. The 41st Division was then the only major force of the U.S. Army in Australia. The key for the successful defense of Australia and New Zealand was the security of their lines of communication to the U.S. West Coast and Hawaii. In the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the main arena for discussing strategic issues facing the United States, the Navy and Army had fundamentally different views on strategy in the Pacific. The U.S. Navy realized by February that the Philippines were lost. Hence, it believed, the defense of Australia and of communications to that country was of vital interest to the Allied cause. In contrast, the Army's Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, was adamant that the principal effort must be a cross-channel invasion of Europe. The chief proponent of that view was Brigadier General Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed as the Chief of the War Plans Division on 16 February 1942. For the Army and Eisenhower, the main conditions for winning the war were defense of the United Kingdom, continued participation of the Soviet Union in the war, and preservation of Allied positions in the Middle East and India for preventing the junction of German and Japanese forces. In Eisenhower's view, the Japanese conquest of the NEI removed one of the major reasons for making a stand in the Southwest Pacific. Because the Japanese now controlled the region's oil and tin and practically the world's entire rubber resources, the reasons for committing more forces in the theater were less compelling than they were 3 months ago.
King was persistent in his efforts to establish island bases with Army troops and land-based aircraft. He secured a small Army force to garrison Bora Bora in the French Society Group. By early January 1942, the Army had promised to send troops to Canton and Christmas Islands in the Gilberts, Kiribati today, thereby providing additional security to Samoa. It also promised to garrison New Caledonia. On 5 February, King recommended that Funafuti Atoll in the Ellis Islands, Tuvalu today, be made an advance base to cover Fiji and Samoa. He was concerned with the Japanese activity in the Gilberts and was convinced that the Allies had to interpose bases between them and southern Pacific islands. On 5 March, at a meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with President Roosevelt, the main topic was Pacific strategy. Roosevelt seemed to agree with King's views on the strategy to be followed in the Pacific. This in turn led King to direct Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, Chief of the War Plans Division, to develop a comprehensive plan for the war in the Pacific. On 16 March, King suffered a major setback. The Joint Chiefs decided to implement a War Department plan for rapid buildup in Europe and restriction of reinforcements in the Pacific to current commitments. Nevertheless, the Joint Chiefs approved King's request for bases at Afedi and Tongatabu. The Army believed that 3 divisions in the southwestern Pacific were sufficient. The Joint Chiefs approved a single Army Air Forces AAF pursuit squadron for Christmas Island, Canton, Tongatabu, and Efate. Fiji and New Caledonia would have 2 squadrons each of medium bombers, about 60 in all. The theater. The size and physical characteristics of a maritime theater play important, even critical roles in the conduct of war at sea.
The Coral Sea and Solomon Islands operation was conducted over a relatively large part of the southwestern Pacific. The 1,850,000 square mile Coral Sea is very deep, average depth about 7,850 feet. It is bounded in the west by northeastern Australia and the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Queensland, in the north by southeast New Guinea, the WWII archipelago, the Solomon Islands, and the Santa Cruz Islands, and in the east by the New Hebrides and Loyalty Island groups and New Caledonia. Its southern boundary runs along latitude 25 degrees south. The distance from Cooktown to Espiritu Santo Island is about 1,300 miles, while the Guadalcanal is about 950 miles away from latitude 25 degrees south. Hence, the Coral Sea provided ample room for carrier operations. The Coral Sea is generally free of navigational hazards, except for numerous islands and reefs on the western, northern, and eastern fringes, and the 1,600-mile-long Great Barrier Reef to the west. The only routes through the WWII archipelago to the Solomon Sea in the north are the then poorly charted Jomard
Passage, 4.9 nautical miles wide, and the 4-mile-wide China Strait off the southeastern tip of New Guinea. The Coral Sea is occasionally subject to fronts moving off Australia, bringing towering cumulus clouds, showers, and squalls over areas 50 to 150 miles wide. The weather is dominated by southeasterly trade winds. Hence, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese carriers, moving southward into the prevailing wind, were able to launch their aircraft much faster than the Allied carriers, which had to turn into the wind away from the enemy carriers to launch and recover. On the other hand, the southeasterly wind gave the Allied carriers an advantage during their withdrawal from the operating area. The Japanese controlled a large number of positions in the central and southwestern Pacific prior to the Port Moresby Solomons operation. The most important naval and air base in the Central Carolines was Truk Lagoon, 49 by 30 miles in size. Likewise, the newly acquired base at Rabaul, about 640 miles south from Truk, was centrally located in the southwest Pacific. It has a first-class anchorage. A 620-mile land-based aviation patrol arc encompassed the Solomons to the east, most of eastern New Guinea to the west, and half of the Solomon Sea to the south. Other important positions occupied by the Japanese in early 1942 were Manus Island in the Admiralties, Gasmata on New Britain, Cavieng on New Ireland, Buka Island, Kieta and Buen on Bougainville, Faisi Island, and Salamaua and Lae on New Guinea. The majority of these bases included airfields or seaplane facilities. Rabaul had then two operational airfields, Lakunai and Vunakanau, used by both fighters and bombers. A third was under construction. Both Cavieng and Gasmata had airfields. Kieta had a landing strip but was not suitable for military aircraft. Faisi Island could serve as a seaplane base. Salamaua had a seaplane base. The airfields at Salamaua and Lae were used by fighters and bombers. The anchorage at Shortland Island, seized by the Japanese on 13 March 1942, southeast of Bougainville, could shelter a large number of ships. An inlet at the eastern side of Shortland could serve as a seaplane base. From the Allied perspective, the largest and the most important position was Port Moresby on New Guinea. Port Moresby is separated from northeastern Australia, 310 miles away by the Gulf of Papua and the 90-mile-wide Torres Strait. It was excellently located to support air attacks against the eastern and southeastern coast of New Guinea and the Admiralties. Port Moresby was vulnerable to a landing from the sea. The 13,360-foot Owen Stanley Range provided a degree of security from attack overland. Control of Port Moresby would allow the Japanese to blockade the eastern sea approaches to Darwin and deny the Allies a forward base in New Guinea. It would also pose a threat of invasion against eastern Australia. Port Moresby lacked good port facilities to serve as a base when the Australian troops arrived in early 1941. Port Moresby remained virtually useless for Allied heavy bombers. The nearest supporting airfields were at Townsville, some 700 miles away in Australia. In the spring of 1942, Port Moresby was defended by several thousand poorly trained and equipped troops. The rest of New Guinea was defended by a local militia called the New Guinea Volunteer Reserve. The principal bases for the Allied ships were Tonga Tapu in the Friendly Islands, or Tonga, Noumea on New Caledonia, Ifat in the New Hebrides, Suva and Nandi in Fiji, and Tutuila in the American Protectorate of Samoa. However, none were suitable for basing aircraft carriers. The nearest place usable for dry docking aircraft carriers was Pearl Harbor, and for cruisers and destroyers, Sydney, Australia. Noumea's harbor could accommodate ships of any size. Its entrances were protected by mines, except for the Bullen Passage.
Harbor facilities existed at Port Moresby, St. James Bay, on Espiritu Santo Island in the New Hebrides, and Noumea. All of the Allied air forces used fields at Townsville, Charters Towers, Cloncurry, and Darwin in northern Australia. Horn Island was an intermediate field for aircraft flying to and from Port Moresby. The airfields at Port Moresby were small and were used only for fighter aircraft and as a staging point for bombers en route to the New Hebrides and the Solomons. They also lacked dispersal areas and hence were vulnerable to attack by fighters and bombers. Tulagi was a valuable base for searches by flying boats, but was poorly defended and highly vulnerable. The Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, operated a few PBY-5 Catalina flying boats from Gavutu Harbour on Tulagi until 2 May, when these aircraft were withdrawn. The Allies also started construction of an airfield at La Tontouta, New Caledonia, as another at Efate, a defended base for fighters and dive bombers, was nearing completion. The anchorage at Noumea was not suitable as a seaplane base because it lacked anti-aircraft or AA defenses. Catalinas were also able to use anchorages at White Sand Point and Mele Bay, the New Hebrides. The Japanese base of operations prior to the Moresby-Solomons operation, anchored at Rabaul, greatly facilitated the offensive employment of naval forces and land-based aircraft toward the Solomons, the Leeward Archipelago, and southeastern New Guinea. The Japanese naval forces and aircraft based at Rabaul operated along short and diverging lines of operations. For example, the sea distance from Rabaul to Lae is about 450 miles. Tulagi is about 550 miles by the sea southeast of Rabaul. The flying distance from Rabaul to Moresby is about 500 miles. In the spring of 1942, the Allied base of operations in the South Pacific stretched in the general westerly direction. It flanked the lines of communication from the U.S. West Coast, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal to New Zealand and Australia. Yet it was unfavorable for preventing the Japanese from gaining control of additional strong points in the South Pacific. The distances separating the Allied bases from each other and to the enemy bases were long. For example, the sea distance from Noumea to Tonga Tabu, Tonga, is about 1,000 miles. New Caledonia and the New Hebrides are about the same distance from Australia's coast. The distances from Samoa and Fiji to Rabaul are 2,230 and 3,540 miles, respectively. Noumea and Rabaul are separated by about 1,385 miles of water. The base of operations for the Allied land-based aircraft in northeastern Australia was far from the newly acquired Japanese bases in the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomons. For example, the air distances from Townsville and Cairns to Rabaul are 1,100 and 980 miles, respectively. Allied aircraft based in northeastern Australia operated along long and converging lines of operations against targets off the eastern coast of Papua New Guinea.
The Japanese lines of communication within the Bismarck Archipelago and towards southeastern and eastern New Guinea were almost identical to their line of operations. Their hub was Rabaul, and they were short and relatively easy to protect by land-based aircraft and ships. The route between the Bismarcks and the Lower Solomons runs through deep water and is partially sheltered. In contrast, the Allied lines of communication to Australia and New Zealand were very long and highly vulnerable to the attacks by enemy submarines. For example, the distances from the Panama Canal to Brisbane and Auckland are 7,765 and 6,540 nautical miles, respectively. Operational command structures. The Japanese in the southern and southwestern Pacific lacked a single theater commander having command and control of all naval and ground forces. The Fourth Fleet, the operational designation of which was the South Seas Fleet, was responsible for all operations in the South Pacific, Caroline Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and Palau. The commander was Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, with headquarters in Truk. The secondary base was at Kwajalein, the Marshalls. All Japanese naval land-based aircraft in the Southwest and in the South Pacific were subordinate to the 11th Air Fleet under Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukuhara at Tainan in the Marianas. The 11th Air Fleet consisted of the 21st, 24th, 25th, and 26th Air Flotillas. It was responsible for securing eastern New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, the Marshalls, Wake Island, the Eastern Carolines, and the area around the Japanese homeland. It was also to cooperate with the 4th and the 5th Fleets. The 24th and the 25th Air Flotillas were attached to the 4th Fleet until control returned to the 11th Air Fleet on 17 April. The 24th Air Flotilla was redeployed out of the area, leaving only the 25th Air Flotilla to support the 4th Fleet. Its headquarters, under Rear Admiral Sadayoshi Yamada, was moved to Rabaul on March 29th and was activated on April 1st. The 25th Air Flotilla was designated the 5th Air Attack Force, 5 AAF, for operational purposes. The entire Pacific had been designated as an area of U.S. strategic responsibility. On March 9, 1942, the Allies formally divided the Pacific Theater into 3 large areas, or, in modern terms, theaters of war: the Southwest Pacific Area, the Southeast Pacific Area, and the Pacific Ocean areas. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed as the commander, Southwest Pacific Area. He formally assumed this responsibility on April 18, 1942. The ANZAC area was formally abolished on April 22, and Admiral Leary was appointed Commander Allied Naval Forces, Southwest Pacific Area. On April 3, the POA was subdivided into 3, in modern terms, theaters of operations: the North Pacific Area, above latitude 42 degrees north, the Central Pacific Area, from north latitude 42 to the equator, and the South Pacific Area, south of the equator and between the eastern boundary of the Southwest Pacific Area and longitude 110 degrees west.
Nimitz took officially the post of Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Areas, in addition to that of SINPAC, at 11 o'clock on 8 May 1942, when the Battle of the Coral Sea was almost over. Nimitz was directed to appoint a commander for the South Pacific area who, quote, acting under his authority and general direction, would exercise command of the combined armed forces, which at any time might be assigned that area, unquote. However, that post was not filled until 19 June 1942, when Vice Admiral Robert Lee Gormley assumed command of SOPAC. He initially established his headquarters at Auckland, New Zealand. Nimitz exercised command over all U.S. naval forces in the Pacific Theater, including those in the Coral Sea, by virtue of his authority as SINPAC. But the Coral Sea itself was formally part of MacArthur's SWPA. Nimitz and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, Commander Task Force 17, CTF-17, had no control over supporting forces, such as Army Air Forces elements, which were provided by MacArthur. The resolution of this problem was that when American carriers and British or Australian forces operated in the same general area, the Carrier Task Force commander would be in overall command. In all other cases, the senior commander of either 3 nations would be in command. The preliminaries. After the capture of Rabaul and other points in the Bismarck Archipelago, IGHQ directed the 4th Fleet on 2 February to attack and capture strategic areas in British New Guinea and the Solomons as soon as possible. The first operational objective was to seize the ports of Lae and Salamaua in the Huon Gulf on the southeastern coast of New Guinea, the SR operation. On 13 February, the Japanese Navy and Army signed an Army-Navy local agreement setting execution of Operation SR for 25 February. On 26 February, Admiral Inoue and Major General Tomitaro Hori, commander of the South Seas Force, or detachment, agreed that the 2nd Battalion of the 144th Infantry Regiment, reinforced by 1 mountain artillery battery and other units, would attack Salamaua, while 1 battalion would capture Leh. In mid-February, Admiral King temporarily transferred Task Force 11, TF-11, based on the carrier USS Lexington, CV-2, to the ANZAC area. Admiral Leary, together with CTF-11, Vice Admiral Wilson Brown, was planning to attack Rabaul. B-17 heavy bombers based at Townsville would strike Rabaul at the same time. On 20 February, Task Force 11 reached a point of about 350 miles south of Rabaul, where Japanese land-based aircraft detected it. In the ensuing encounters in the air, the Japanese lost 18 aircraft, and the Americans only 2.
However, the element of surprise had been lost, and hence the carrier attack on Rabaul was abandoned. A major effect of this aborted raid was that Inoue decided to delay the SR operation until 8 March. On 4 March, the 24th Air Flotilla started raids on Port Moresby, Leh, and Bulolo, some 37 miles southwest of Leh. The next day, the Japanese convoy sorted from Rabaul bound for the Huon Gulf. 2 days later, the convoy split into 2 groups, one to Leh and the other to Salamaua. On the night of 7th, 8 March, the Japanese landed and quickly captured both without opposition and immediately started to build bases. By seizing control of the Huon Gulf, the Japanese had obtained control of the straits between northeast New Guinea and New Britain, as well as positions from which they could support further advances to the southward. Nimitz reacted strongly to the Japanese landings in the Huon Gulf by sending TF-17, centered on the carrier Yorktown, CV-5, and TF-11 with Lexington, CV-2, screened by 8 cruisers and 14 destroyers across the Coral Sea and into the Gulf of Papua. On 10 March, 104 Allied aircraft attacked Japanese shipping in the Huon Gulf from a position about 50 miles southwest of Port Moresby. The Allied aircraft achieved complete surprise by approaching through the 7,500-foot pass over the Owen Stanley Range. Japanese sources cited losses as 4 transports sunk, 3 ships damaged moderately, and 3 lightly, 11 fighter aircraft lost, and 130 men killed and 245 wounded. Among damaged ships were 1 seaplane tender, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer. Allied post-war sources claim much larger Japanese losses, 13 out of 18 transports sunk or damaged, of which several had to return to Japan for repairs. About 400 Japanese were killed in the attack. The losses in shipping could not be replaced quickly. That was one reason that Inoue decided to postpone the Port Moresby Solomons operation for 1 month. Another reason was increased Allied air strength over New Guinea. Allied and the Japanese land-based aircraft conducted sporadic attacks on each other's airfields starting in late January. The Allies raided Rabaul with small numbers of aircraft every other night from 24 January to 3 February. Allied attacks on Leh intensified in April. B-26 medium bombers struck on 9, 11, 12, 18, and 19 April. On the 11th and 13th, attacks on Leh by a small number of medium bombers and fighters caused extensive damage, forcing the Japanese to move aircraft to Rabaul. After further raids on Rabaul on 22nd and 23rd April, the Allies used only 2 to 3 medium bombers, leading the Japanese erroneously to believe that the enemy's air strength at Port Moresby had greatly reduced. In fact, however, the Allies had reinforced Port Moresby, deploying additional P-39 fighters and basing B-25 bombers on Horned Island off the York Peninsula.
The 25th Air Flotilla intensified its attacks on Port Moresby in early April from Rabaul and Leh. The Japanese raids generally used only about half of a dozen land-based attack aircraft and several fighters. For this reason, these attacks were not decisive. The 25th Air Flotilla began full-scale raids on Port Moresby on 17 April with 15 fighters and 7 attack aircraft, striking almost daily until the beginning of May. The Japanese plans for the Port Moresby Solomons operation were based on poor knowledge of the whereabouts and movements of enemy naval forces, the carriers in particular. This was a major reason for several decisions that caused major problems and setbacks for the Japanese in the course of the operation. Their main sources of information were visual observation by land-based search aircraft and submarines, interrogations of captured airmen, analysis of combat experience, and intercepts of plaintext messages. The Japanese, unable to decode the Allied radio traffic, lacked direct knowledge of enemy plans and intentions, but their analysis of open sources such as the Allied broadcasts and printed media was generally good. For sea reconnaissance, the Japanese relied on land-based medium bombers, float planes, and aircraft based on ships, though rarely carriers. The Japanese had fairly accurate information on the strength of enemy garrisons and air elements. For example, on 23 April, the 4th Fleet estimated correctly that Tulagi had a small garrison, but that Port Moresby was defended by about 5,000 troops. The Japanese assessed, again correctly, that Allied air strength in Australia had been increased to probably 200 first-line aircraft. They knew that the Allies had concentrated air strength in the Port Moresby, Port Darwin, and Townsville areas, and that air activity in those areas was intense. However, the Japanese had very poor knowledge of the overall strength of enemy forces in the southern and southwestern Pacific. Their single greatest mistake was to assume, in the absence of information to the contrary, that there was little probability of the existence of a powerful force in the area after the withdrawal of the U.S. carrier force. Yet they also believed that it was not unlikely that the enemy might conduct their own operations against our South Seas Fleet operational area, east or south. The only U.S. carrier believed to be in the area is the Saratoga. These estimates were based on information from a Japanese picket boat that the Americans had used 3 carriers in their raid on Tokyo on 18 April. But from interrogations of captured pilots, the Japanese learned that only 2 carriers, Ernet Prize and Hornet, had taken part. This meant, they assessed, that 2 others, Yorktown and Saratoga, were available. They erroneously believed that Lexington had been sunk by a Japanese submarine in January 1942. They did not know that Saratoga had sustained damage and was under repair. In any case, having observed no enemy carriers in the southern area since 10th March, the Japanese assumed that only one large carrier, Saratoga, would be operating there. They believed that the Royal Navy might have in Australian waters a battleship, 2 or 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and several destroyers. They also assume that even if the enemy submarines are not particularly active, there's a strong chance that at least 2 or 3 would operate in the area.
Japanese plans and preparations. Inoue of the 4th Fleet and his staff were primarily responsible for planning the employment of naval forces and base air forces, i.e. naval land-based aircraft, in the southwest and south. General Horry, commander of the brigade-sized South Seas Force, and his staff planned for the Army troops. In connection with the high-level strategic debates discussed above, an IGHQ directive of 29 January had stipulated that Port Moresby and Tulagi should be seized immediately after Lae and Salamaua. That is, the Port Moresby Solomons operation would be executed in March 1942, supported by land-based aircraft from Rabaul and seaplanes from newly constructed bases in Lae, Salamaua, and Finschhafen. The original assumption that the enemy would have no carriers in the area became invalid in the light of the raids of February and March 1942 and growing enemy air strength in Australia. As we have seen, in Inoue's view, the capture of Port Moresby and Tulagi would entail much more risk than initially envisaged and would need strong support by the large carrier force. However, Yamamoto needed all 5 large carriers. Kaga had been damaged in a grounding in February 1942, and 4 battleships for raids against Ceylon and in the Bay of Bengal in early April, Operation C. Inoue sent a message to the combined fleet on 20 March, pointing out that considering the experience of the Lae Salamaua operation, especially the appearance of the enemy carrier force, it would be very difficult to assign protection for the transport convoy by land-based air units and to protect the airbase establishment and the landing point after disembarkation. He continued,
I would like to see discussion during a central agreement to doubly ensure the strengthening of land-based air units and the cooperation of a fully equipped aircraft carrier for the coming operation. The carrier Shoho, 14,200 tons full displacement, currently assigned for the operation to the 4th Fleet, was not sufficient in itself. Final plans for the Port Moresby Solomons operation were developed by the 4th Fleet and subordinate commanders during April 1942. The plans were
considerably affected by Yamamoto's decisions regarding the timeline of the Midway Aleutians operation and the availability of carriers. The 4th Fleet also depended on the combined fleet for additional cruisers and destroyers and land-based naval aircraft. On 5 April, Admiral Ugaki, the Combined Fleet Chief of Staff, circulated an outline of organizational changes based on IJN Directive No. 86. Among other things, the Port Moresby operation, to be codenamed MO operation, would take place in early May, prior to the Midway Aleutians operation. From 20 April to 10 May, the combined fleet would attach to the 4th Fleet the large carrier Kaga, 1 seaplane tender, Cruiser Division 5, Haguro and Myoko, Cruiser Division 6, Aweba, Kinugasa, Kako, and Furutaka, and Destroyer Divisions 7 and 27. Inoue also learned that the 24th and 25th Air Flotillas would return to the direct control of the 11th Air Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Tsukahara. In addition, the combined fleet attached the light carrier Shoho from the 4th Air Flotilla to the 4th Fleet. Until then, it had been used only for ferrying aircraft. Initially scheduled to take effect on May 10th, the command changes were later advanced to 20 April. Also on 5 April, Yamamoto directed Inoue that all plans for the 4th Fleet had to be completed by May 10th. It was this change, combined with the advance of the date for the execution of the Midway Aleutians operation to early June, that had made it impossible to provide the frontline large carrier division Inoue had been promised in March. Inoue had been a strong opponent of the Midway operation because the 4th Fleet would have to garrison and supply the island after its capture. He was now even more distressed that only one large carrier would be assigned to the MO operation, and asked the combined fleet to reconsider. Inoue specifically requested that Carrier Division 2, as seen now, was one of the most effective formations in the entire Navy. Another problem with the schedule was that the 25th Air Flotilla would not have sufficient time to neutralize air opposition in the area prior to the start of the operation. Its major components would not be ready for combat until 20 April. Yamamoto, however, was reluctant to assign Carrier Division 2 to the 4th Fleet. That division, together with Carrier Division 1, would be part of the pending Midway Aleutians operation. Also, both carrier divisions needed refitting and training upon their return from the Indian Ocean. Yamamoto therefore decided on 10 April to allocate to the South Seas Fleet Carrier Division 5, composed of the new carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, plus 2 destroyer divisions. However, Carrier Division 5 was the least experienced carrier unit in the combined fleet. This order became effective on 18 April.
The 4th Fleet's planners considered 3 options for seizing Port Moresby: a land approach over the Owen Stanley Range, a barge mobilization, and a standard landing operation. Capturing Port Moresby by advancing overland was feasible if a road were built over difficult mountainous terrain. Some Army commanders preferred this option to the risks of troops embarking on ships, which could be sunk. Barge mobilization meant landing troops in the southeastern part of New Guinea and then transporting them to Port Moresby by self-propelled barges to successive points along the coast. These landings would be conducted during the night to reduce the threat of the enemy's air attack. The Japanese estimated that, at an average advance of 68 miles each night, they would need about 5 days to reach Port Moresby.
The problem was that the sea route to Port Moresby was navigationally very difficult due to reefs and other obstacles. The barges would have to travel far from the shore. Barge mobilization would have been extremely difficult, but WWII believed it feasible. Hence, in early April, he directed studies for transportation of food and munitions, embarkation rosters, cooking arrangements, etc. But in the end, a standard landing was adopted, despite high risks for the convoy and covering forces. The strengthening of the Fourth Fleet had given its planners increased confidence. The Japanese conducted extensive reconnaissance of the area of Port Moresby and the sea routes from Rabaul westward and southward. The Army commander had asked the Navy to obtain photographs of the landing area at Port Moresby and the sea area between there and the island of Samarai in the China Strait. Army officers accompanied reconnaissance flights over the landing area after 10 April. Yet after numerous reconnaissance and photographic flights, the Japanese acknowledged that they still lacked accurate information on facilities and enemy strength. As the Japanese usually did in preparing for amphibious landings, the 24th Air Flotilla in March conducted reconnaissance flights over the projected route to determine the best sites for seaplane bases. The 25th Air Flotilla did the same in mid-April. The Japanese surveyed waterways east of Australia, confirmed the accuracy of charts, reconnoitered airfields on Horn Island off Cape York in northern Australia, and photographed both landing sites at Port Moresby and potential barge routes. For some of these purposes, the Japanese used short-range, single-float reconnaissance biplanes that operated from shore bases established by tenders or from the tenders themselves. On 16 April, WWII convened a two-day staff meeting to discuss the plan and arrange final orders. Many subordinate commanders voiced strong misgivings. One major problem was the vulnerability of the MO invasion force along the
Southern coast of Papua New Guinea. Enemy air bases were only about 300 miles away, and swift currents and numerous islands surrounded by reefs severely interfered with the passage of ships. 95. The MO invasion force had three main routes available: the 670-mile-long westward route via the China Strait, a 950-mile route passing eastward around the Lusíadas, and an 840-mile route southward through the Lusíadas via the Jamard Passage and then across the Coral Sea to Port Moresby. The route through the China Strait was the shortest and ran mostly over deep water. It was also least exposed to the enemy air attacks. However, ships would have to sail in a single column. The eastward route was free of navigational obstacles, but was 110 miles longer than the southward route. It was also more exposed to attack by the enemy submarines. The southward route was less navigationally difficult than going westward and more secure than the eastward route. Planners adopted it as a compromise. 96. The plan was to organize the convoy of ships, 5 from the Army and 6 from the Navy. The convoy, after departing from Rabaul, would run through St. George's Channel and then south-southwest, turn southwest, and when eastward of Woodlark Island, Muyua today, head toward De Boyne Island, and then enter the Coral Sea through the Jamard Passage, some 420 nautical miles southward from Rabaul. Afterward, and for the remainder of its advance to the landing objective, the convoy would be open to attack by the enemy aircraft based at Townsville and Cooktown. The planners calculated that if the Jamard Passage was navigated during the evening and a constant speed of 11 knots was maintained, the convoy would be exposed to attack in the Coral Sea for the next 12 hours. Hence, it was critical to obtain local sea control in the Coral Sea by the MO carrier force. The basic idea for doing so was to send the MO carrier force sweeping around to the east of the Solomons to avoid the enemy air searches, to enter the Coral Sea from the southeast, as the MO main force passed to the westward. See sidebar, Japanese Order of Battle, May 1942, 98. The Japanese planners also grappled with the problem of the barrier reef fronting Port Moresby. The reef is a natural fortress, running along the coast from the eastern tip of New Guinea to Port Moresby, at the distance of from 2 to 10 miles.
Passage by landing craft was impeded at both low and high tides. Outside Port Moresby, the large Senavi and Nataera reefs must be penetrated by three possible routes: the Liljeblad Passage, the Basilisk Passage, and the Padana Nafua. The Liljeblad Passage was within firing range of the Pafa Coast Defense Battery south of Port Moresby. The current is swift, and sunken reefs lie in the passage and en route to harbor. This route was unsuitable for a large landing.
Coming soon. Next part. Subscribe now and click the bell icon. Thanks, sir.